All right, welcome back to Positively Ole Miss. We continue our previews around the SEC with Vanderbilt. Matt Perkins from Believe and Vanderbilt Football joining us today. You know, believe it or not, a couple of years ago, I think it was James Franklin's last year, I was embedded inside the McGugan Center on signing day. It was the year that Robert Kendichi and Laquan Treadwell went to Ole Miss, and me and Pat Forty were covering it for Yahoo, and it was a pretty good experience, and it really provided a blueprint. It's like, hey, Vandy doesn't have to be the Vandy of old. It can be something else. You just have to have the right guy for the job. Now, my question is Clark Lee right for that job?
Better than Derek Mason is. I'll tell you that much.
Yeah.
Mace is a great man, but you need to be a little bit firmer, I think, to really get success at Vanderbilt. I think James Franklin was someone who's a little bit firmer, both with the players and the administration. I think Clark Lee is too. And I think the fact that Clark Lee is an alum and has experience in the building and has relationships in the building really helped. One of the reasons that James Franklin was so successful is that he was not afraid to go up to the administration and say, I need this, and this, and I'm not taking no for an answer. Mason is a very bright defensive mind, an extraordinarily just good person. But I don't think he had that sort of, I don't want to say testicular fortitude, but just the confidence in himself and in the program to say, if we're going to get to the next level, we need to do this. So I have very high hopes in Clark Lee. I have even more hopes in some ways about actually some of the holders over on the team and the job he's done hiring coordinators.
Yeah, I'm in favor of Clark Lee. I think the hire of Barton Simmons is a nice little outside the box hire. I worked with Barton for several years at Rivals before he went off to 247. And Clark Lee could be the right guy. He could be the right directions. But let's paint the picture. What are the expectations for a successful Vanderbilt season this year?
A successful Vanderbilt season this year, is to, I think, win 3 of your 4 non-conference games. I think that you have to be able to go in. You have to obviously beat ETSU first week. I mean, if you don't beat ETSU,
Yeah.
I mean, that's going to be kind of sad. That's going to be really sad. Like,
It's going to be a long year.
It's going to be a very long year. I also think that it's really important that they just don't roll over in SEC play. Part of the problem last year, I mean, especially if you watched the game against Ole Miss last year, they just absolutely rolled over and played dead in the second half. And I don't think a Clark Lee team is going to do that, but I think that we need to see this team just not just give up and give up hope on itself. Now, I think that we've seen a lot of really positives coming out of, whether it was spring ball or fall camp. I think this team is going to have a lot more gusto, a lot more moxie than last year's team did. Last year was just, COVID hit every school in some way, shape, or form. It hit Vanderbilt in a way that was unlike any other. They had more COVID opt-outs than any other program in the SEC, and that's starting with a roster that's already at a talent disadvantage because of the inherent, recruiting issues that Vanderbilt has, whether it's the academic standards of the school or the fact that it just doesn't have a football tradition like most of the other programs in the conference. So when you combine the fact that they lost a ton of players and were already down a lot of players to begin with, a bunch of guys going into the portal, it was always going to be a long season. There were a couple bright spots. Ken Seals showed, that he has the makings of something. I don't know what that something is quite yet. I don't think that we entirely got it, but, there were definitely a couple bright spots. And I think that this year, the other big thing we have to see is progress from the offense. I have no expectations.
Okay.
They lost their 2 best defensive players to the NFL in Andre Mintz and Dayo Adengbo. They lost their best freshman, Donovan Kaufman, who transferred to Auburn, kind of went with Derek Mason. He was one of the lone bright spots on that defense, and I'm not sure how many people are going to be able to stop, but I do have high hopes for the offense, especially the wide receiver room. I think you can make an argument that Vanderbilt has a top 4 wide receiving core in the SEC. That's probably their only position group that you can probably put in the top half, but their wide receiver room is good and it's deep.
Yeah, it really is. And I consider myself the president of the Ken Seals fan club.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a huge Ken Seals guy. His dad actually follows me on Twitter because I tweet so much about Ken Seals.
Robert Seals. Yep.
Yes. And I really like the moxie that kid plays with. He seems like, as for a true freshman, going down in your first start in College Station, Texas, against those guys, he really showed himself well. And even in the Ole Miss game, whenever, like you said, the Vanderbilt team just kind of laid down a little bit, he competed and he really showed himself pretty well. And I'm looking forward to seeing what he can produce in year 2 of this experiment. And my question to you is there hope? Is he going to win the job? First of all, I'll be crushed if he doesn't win the job.
He's the day one starter for sure.
Okay.
He's the day one starter for sure. I think that Mike Wright there's a lot of great things about Mike Wright. If you're the president of the Ken Seals fan club, I might be like, I'm probably like the vice chancellor of the Mike Wright fan club. I think that he brings a lot to the table. He's a phenomenal athlete. I mean, Georgia State champion in the 200 meters in high school. He can absolutely scoop. And he got some interesting game experience. Now, I didn't love the way that seemed like every time the Commodores got into the red zone, or especially within like the 10-yard line, the 5-yard line last year, they bring in Wright. And I don't love just that coming in every time. He's a great changeup. I think you need to have packages for him. But honestly, he needs to be used more like the Rebels used John Reese Plumlee. More so than just having him just be like kind of like a red zone quarterback.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. And the predictability of the red zone. Hugh Freeze used to do that with Jeremy Liggins at Ole Miss back in 14 and 15. You get inside the 5-yard line, here comes Liggins. They're going to run the quarterback power. It's going to work about half the time, and it just is what it is. Now, what's the future for Vanderbilt football after the season? What is Clark Lee trying to develop? Because my theory is that Vanderbilt should be leading these smart schools and not doing what other smart schools are doing.
I concur. I think that Vanderbilt, I think with Clark Lee, this team is going to try to be tougher and more rugged than Vanderbilt teams in the past. I felt like they got a little bit too cutesy at times, especially under Coach Mason. Whereas I think Clark Lee is going to bring I hate to use the cliche of like, bring your lunch pail and that kind of thing. But I think we're going to see a return to that type of football. I think that's what was successful under James Franklin. And I think they're just going to sort of build this around sort of Clark Lee's identity. Clark Lee was a walk-on fullback who turned himself into a pretty darn good SEC player. And he is just a tough dude, and I think he's going to mold the team around that identity of toughness and just not backing down to anyone.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do about that in the course of the season, how Vanderbilt actually looks, how they look in Game 8 as opposed to Game 1, because everybody's fired up in Game 1. But what do they look like in Game 8 when Vanderbilt might be 3-5 or 2-6 going into the season? Do you mail it in or do you fight all the way to the end? Because there's a game at the end of the schedule that is gettable for Vanderbilt and is a swing game for both Josh Heupel and Clark Lee.
Absolutely. That Tennessee game, and I think the South Carolina game, which is in the middle of their schedule this year. Personally, I'm really down on South Carolina. I think that job is a huge rebuild at this point. They are really lacking talent, especially on the defensive side of the football. I mean, that's a team that finished 13th in the SEC on defense last year and then lost J.C. Horn. I mean, outside of Kingsley Enagbare, like, I do not think that is a terribly strong football team. That game against Tennessee, man, I mean, Vandy gets up for Tennessee. They always get up for Tennessee. And, if you talk to, Ryan Seymour, my co-host on Believe in Vanderbilt Football, or my former co-host, Zach Stacy, like, you will, you hear these guys, like, they are so dialed in when they play Tennessee because they feel like little brother, and rightfully so. I mean, Tennessee, historically has been a much stronger program. But I think that with all the turmoil around the UT program between, McDonald's Baggate and losing half that roster to the transfer portal. And personally, I think Heupel I've referred to him as overhyped so far because I didn't really think he did all that great of a job at UCF. I mean, that team got progressively worse every year under his tutelage. Now, obviously, the injury to Mackenzie Milton has a lot to do with that, but still, you would have liked to have seen some sort of growth, and I think that team regressed every year. And him coming in so late in the game after Black Monday is, it's tough for. It was going to be tough for Tennessee to get a really high quality coach in that situation anyway. But additionally, on top of that, it is just, I don't know, it's a really tough job right now at Tennessee, and I think it's going to take them a couple years to really right the ship and get back on track. But fan expectations for the Volunteer Navy are so out of whack on a year-to-year basis, and I think that's true this year more than ever. They had such a talent drain. You think about their top players at almost every position, and the fact they're still not settled on a quarterback. I guess it's going to be Hendon Hooker this year, but where does that leave Harrison Bailey? The guy who was supposed to be sort of the savior to that program. I'm not really sure, what's going to happen with him. I don't know. I am obviously a little bit biased, but like my wife, Vandy alum, like she does not allow us to have anything orange in the household. And like literally anything orange in the house. Like you will not see an orange object in our house because she hates Tennessee. And so I'm obviously always going to be down on them a little bit more than most, but I really just don't see that program, getting to the heights that sort of Volunteer fans expect them to. So yeah, I do think Vandy can win that game. I think Vandy can also win the game against South Carolina. Probably about it. Maybe Mississippi State, depending on how you feel Mike Leach year 2. Now, typically Leach teams in their second season take a big jump forward offensively. I'm not the biggest Will Rogers fan in the world. I'm not leading the Will Rogers fan club. I saw him against Vanderbilt, but the defense that Vanderbilt played against Mississippi State last year was literally one of the dumbest schemes I've seen in my entire life. Like literally one of the stupidest schemes. They put 3 guys on the line of scrimmage that were like barely even rushing. They brought no pressure whatsoever. Now I understand you want to sit in a soft zone sometimes against that, against those air raid offenses and to make them throw it into holes, but that's all they practice, man. And so like he was just picking us apart because it was the dumbest thing. Like Deo Odengbo and Andre Mintz, what do they do best? They get after the passer, especially if they're starting like a wide 9 position. Well, they had them lining up as straight up on the tackles and like playing patty cake with the dudes. It made literally no sense. I was furious watching the game. I was on the phone with Brian and with Bruno Reagan, former Vanderbilt offensive lineman who's been on the pod a bunch of time with us. And we were all yelling at our television simultaneously because it was so asinine.
Yeah, it was a crazy game. There's a lot of state games that just looked weird because they were having trouble with that drop 8 and everybody. I guess it started with Barry Odom in Arkansas. Just bring it, and that was basically the end of KJ Costello at Mississippi State that game. And then you had a true freshman in, so they kept doing it, I guess. How do you see the SEC West besides Tennessee going this year?
The West or the East?
The East, sorry.
I mean, Georgia, I think, is head and shoulders above everybody else. I don't think that even if whatever happens with Eric Gilbert, I still don't think that this is a particularly strong. I don't think that anyone is really going to be able to compete with them. Maybe I actually like Kentucky a little bit more than most. I'm a little bit higher on Kentucky, I think, just because I think that they finally have some talent on the outside with Wan'Dale Robinson, the Nebraska transfer. He is, he does a little bit of everything. He's going to come in the slot. He's going to take handoffs. He's a great returner. Really like the addition of him, and I think that Kentucky has the best offensive line in the conference. I mean, I think they have better offensive line than Alabama, especially with the transfer of Dare Rosenthal up from LSU. Florida, man, they gotta get better on defense. Like they, I'm not worried about the offense with Emory Jones. I think Dan Mullen is going to have an offense no matter what. I think he's proven at this point that no matter who is taking snaps, no matter who his skill position players are, they're going to put up yards and they're going to put up points. I don't think that outside of Kyer Elam, they have any real difference makers on defense, and they had no pass rush last year. I don't see how that's going to get much better this year. I am curious to see how they are able to utilize the Clemson transfer running back, was DeMarcus Bowman, I want to say. DeMarcus Bowman, something like that. He's a former 5-star kid who's now at Florida. He's going to be an interesting piece for that offense. Like I said, I really like Kentucky. I think they're relatively well-rounded, and I like Missouri. I like Missouri to finish fourth. I think Connor Baselak showed some stuff last year offensively. They got some pieces, a couple pieces on the defense. They really retooled their defensive backfield. A couple transfers, a couple important transfers that they brought in there. And at the wide receiver position, they brought in Mookie Cooper from Ohio State, really highly touted recruit from a year ago, who I think will be a big factor immediately for them. Then you've got those three teams at the bottom. I think on talent alone, even considering how many guys they lost in the portal, I still think Tennessee has more talent on paper than South Carolina and Vanderbilt. All three of those schools have new head coaches. Maybe I'm a little bit biased. I think Clark Lee's has the shot of being the best of those three new head coaches, and so I think they're gonna be battling it out for who's gonna lose to Georgia by the least. But those three teams at the bottom, I don't think any of them are a real threat. Maybe my co-host Ryan is like, I don't know what Kool-Aid he's drinking. He thinks Vandy's going bowling this year. I mean, shoot, I want whatever's in his cup, because I am not there with him. I think Vandy, they go 4-8. I think that's a good season. I think if they go 4-8, that's a really good season.
Yeah, I can see if somehow they could figure out a way to beat Stanford and go 4-0 in the non-con, and then get South Carolina and Tennessee. I mean, that's probably the path.
That's what he's saying. But I think Stanford's always good. I think Stanford's always going to be a player, even if the game's in Nashville like it is. I still think that Stanford's going to be tough, man. They are physical. They've always just got maulers on both the offensive and defensive lines. David Shaw's a great coach.
Yeah, they play physical, but at least all those guys have trained in essentially that same type system for the last 4 years. Anybody that's returning, so they're going to be familiar with what Stanford's doing. I'll be interested to see if Stanford's even there, because they're on the descendancy at the moment out in Palo Alto. Moving over to the Western Division, how do you see that shaking out?
I mean, Alabama, until further notice, still. I love Texas A&M, though. I think Texas A&M, it really begins with their defensive line. DeMarvin Leal is, I think, maybe the best player in the conference, regardless of position. He is so versatile on the defensive line. Like, he can line up at tackle, he can line up at end, and he can get after the quarterback no matter what. They definitely have some offensive weapons. I'm not even sure if it really matters who's starting quarterback for them. I really don't. I think that they've got Jaden Weidermeyer, who's probably the best tight end in the country for them on offense. After that, I'm a little bit lower on LSU than most, but I still think that they're probably going to finish third ahead of Auburn and fourth. But I don't love either of those programs at this point. And then, obviously Ole Miss is probably the biggest wild card here, right? I think that they have the biggest range. They could win 10 games or they could win 5 games. I really just don't know how the defense is going to hold up. Jarian Ealy, I think, is in a lot of ways the key to this team. I love Ealy. I think he's one of the most underrated backs in the conference and can do a lot both in the run game and in the pass game. If you remember Lane Kiffin's first season at FAU, Devin Singletary scored like 30 touchdowns.
Mm-hmm.
I think you could see that kind of season from Ealy. I really do. And if that happens, they can win 10 games. They can absolutely win 10 games.
Yeah, one of the things they're working on this year, and there's not a lot of people talking about at the moment, is Jarian Ealy's taking snaps in the slot. John Rice Plumlee has moved to the slot. You will see them mixing and matching on the field at the same time. So there could be handoffs going to John Rice Plumlee in the backfield with Ealy in the slot, being the jet sweep guy. And there's a lot of dangerousness that can come from that look, especially with Matt Corral and the weapons they have on the outside.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Corral's probably going to put up the biggest numbers of any quarterback in the conference. I don't think that is really out of the question.
Mm-hmm.
What's going to hold him back, like with most Lane Kiffin teams, is going to be the defense. What are they going to be able to do? How are they going to be able to stop a team like Alabama that just has 5 stars on 5 stars on 5 stars at every offensive skill position, right? Do they have the guys on the defensive line to hold up against some of those, bigger teams, whether it's a Texas A&M or an Alabama? or even an LSU, something like that. Now, think I think LSU is going to struggle. I think Auburn's going to struggle. I'm not a big Brian Harsin guy. I think that he is, I have friends who are really high on Brian Harsin. I'm like, good for them, but never really coached in the South, and I think that's important, man. Like, I think I don't know if he has those ties, especially for when it comes to recruiting. They've got a lot of interesting dudes in and out. They got a couple really good transfers. I mentioned Donovan Kaufman already. Drayshawn Miller coming down from West Virginia is a great corner. He is a stud cornerback. I think their defensive backs are going to be great this year, but their defensive line, I mean, they just lost a 2-year starter to the transfer portal like a couple days ago in camp in Treadwell. Their offensive line is no great shakes. Yes, they have Tank Bigsby, who is one of the best backs, if not the back in the conference. But I mean, come on, who trusts Bo Nix at this point? Definitely not me. And
all right, I may have lost you there for a second. Let's see. All right, we've done 20 minutes. We lost Matt, apparently. We do appreciate Matt coming by. But we're going to stop it right there. That's 20 minutes of video for the Patreons first, and then we'll release it to the public. Thank everybody. Have a good day.